On December 9, 1969, a thin, sunburned 27-year-old man named Terrence Melcher walked into a Los Angeles County grand jury room to testify about a house he no longer lived in. Reporters in the hallway recognized him mostly because of his mother. Inside, prosecutors wanted to know about a man named Charles Manson, about a rejected record deal, and about a rented house at 10,050 Cielo Drive where 5 people had been murdered 4 months earlier. Melcher had not been present that night. He had not lived there in 7 months. But his name kept surfacing in the testimony, and it would keep surfacing for the rest of his life. He was Doris Day's only child, and the story of what happened to him, what he witnessed, what he carried, what was taken from his family, and how he died, is not the story most people expect when they hear his mother's name. If you're new here, this channel, Old Money Wives, looks at the private lives behind famous names, the parts the headlines rushed past. Consider subscribing if you want more of these. Before any of that, there was Cincinnati. Doris Mary Ann von Kappelhoff, the woman the world would come to know as Doris Day, married trombonist Al Jordan in March 1941. She was 17. He was 23, a musician in bandleader Barney Rapp's orchestra, the same band that had given her the stage name Day. By her own later account, she had initially disliked him, calling him, in one frequently cited remark to her mother, someone she wouldn't go out with even for gold nuggets. He pursued her anyway, and she eventually agreed to marry him. According to multiple biographical accounts, including Day's own 1975 autobiography, the marriage turned violent quickly. Jordan was, by several descriptions, consumed by jealousy. When Day became pregnant, Jordan reportedly demanded she terminate the pregnancy and, when she refused, beat her in what she later described as an attempt to force a miscarriage. One frequently repeated account states that he held a gun to her stomach in a parked car before she talked him out of using it. She refused to end the pregnancy regardless. Terrence Paul Jordan was born on February 8, 1942, in New York City. Day was 19. The abuse, according to her account, did not stop with his birth. Jordan reportedly continued to strike her even while she tried to comfort their crying infant at night, and at one point she was forced to change the locks on their home to keep him out. She filed for divorce, which was finalized in 1943. She returned to Cincinnati and left the infant with her mother, Alma, while she went back on the road, first with Les Brown's band, then through a string of radio and early film work that would build the career the public came to know. Jordan, for his part, saw his son only sporadically afterward and had little ongoing presence in his life. He was later diagnosed, according to several accounts, with schizophrenia. In 1967, he died by suicide. Day reportedly did not grieve the news. This is the first fact worth holding onto in Terry Melcher's story. His earliest years were not shaped by a present father at all, but by his mother's decision to leave a violent marriage rather than remain in one, at significant personal cost, before her career had given her any security to fall back on. Day married saxophonist George Weidler in 1946. That marriage lasted 3 years and, for a time, put Day, her mother, and young Terry into a trailer park home in Los Angeles while she tried to make the relationship work. It did not. By 1951, on her 29th birthday, she married producer Martin Melcher, who formally adopted Terry and gave him the surname by which history would remember him. Whatever else can be said about Martin Melcher, and a great deal would eventually need to be said, he was the first stable adult presence in young Terry's life, and the boy took his name willingly. By late 1969, Terry Melcher had already built a career most 20-somethings in the music business would have envied. Working under the Melcher surname he'd taken from his stepfather rather than the Jordan name of his birth, he had produced the Bayad's first 2 albums, Mr. Tambourine Man and Turn, helping turn Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger songs into folk rock standards. He had worked with Paul Revere and the Raiders, with Gentle Soul, with the Mamas and the Papas, with Bobby Darin and Glenn Campbell. He was, according to the Los Angeles Times, one of the architects of what came to be called the California Sound. Before any of that, in his late teens and early 20s, he had recorded surf records under the names The Rip Chords and, with songwriting partner Bruce Johnston, Bruce and Terry, early, lighter work that gave little indication of where the decade would take him. In 1968, a Beach Boys drummer named Dennis Wilson had introduced him to a man recently released from prison who wanted to be a recording artist. The man's name was Charles Manson. Wilson had picked up two of Manson's followers, Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey, while they were hitchhiking, and had subsequently let Manson and a wider group live at his house for a period. Wilson, taken with Manson's songwriting, recorded two of his compositions with the Beach Boys. Melcher, introduced through that connection, was similarly curious enough, by some accounts, to consider not just a recording contract but a documentary film about Manson's commune and its members. Manson auditioned for Melcher at the house Melcher shared at the time with his girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen, and with musician Mark Lindy of Paul Revere and the Raiders. Melcher was not impressed by what he heard and declined to sign him. He abandoned the documentary idea as well, reportedly after witnessing Manson in a violent confrontation with an intoxicated stuntman. According to multiple accounts, including Beach Boy Mike Love's 2016 memoir Good Vibrations, Melcher had also been considering a documentary film about Manson's group before walking away from the project after witnessing Manson in a violent altercation. Around the same period, Melcher was living at 10,050 CeeLo Drive in Benedict Canyon with his girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen. Manson visited that house more than once looking for Melcher. In January 1969, Melcher moved out. Love wrote that the decision was not incidental. Terry, Doris' only child, was extremely close to his mom, Love wrote. He had told her about Manson and about some of his scary antics, his brandishing of knives, his zombie followers, and that Manson had been to the house on CeeLo and she insisted he move out. 7 months later, on August 9, 1969, the house was leased to director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate. That night, members of the Manson group murdered Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, along with Abigail Folger, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. Manson family member Susan Atkins later told a grand jury that the location had been chosen, in her words, to instill fear in Terry Melcher because he had given the group his word on certain things and never followed through. During the trial, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi argued that Manson believed the murders would intimidate Melcher over the rejected recording contract. Court records and later journalism on the case note something that complicates the simplest version of this story. Police investigators eventually established that Manson knew Melcher no longer lived at the house. Whether the killings were truly meant for him, or whether his name became attached to the crime for other reasons, remains disputed among researchers of the case. This is one of the places where the historical record becomes unusually thin, and where different investigators have reached different conclusions about Melcher's actual role and exposure. What is not disputed is what it did to him afterward. Bill Cassara, a retired Monterey County Sheriff's Sergeant who worked for decades around Doris Day and her family, wrote about Melcher in his 2021 memoir Hollywood in Monterey, Chronicles of a Cop. His account, reported by Fox News, describes a man permanently altered by his association with the case. No one would ever talk about the Manson murders in front of Terry, Cassara wrote. Terry was a very paranoid person. He did not like to be around crowds. He certainly didn't like being recognized. For public appearances involving his mother, Cassara recalled, Melcher arranged for multiple deputies and a sergeant to provide security, not out of vanity, but because the events themselves made him visibly anxious. He once asked Cassara directly to escort Day to a luncheon because public gatherings had become difficult for him to tolerate. Cassara also described an exchange after the murders in which police officers, apparently trying to make conversation, asked Melcher about women associated with the Manson group. Melcher's reaction, by Cassara's account, was immediate distress. He pulled photographs of his own girlfriends from his wallet, as if needing to separate himself, visibly, from any connection to that world. I just felt sorry for him, Cassara wrote. According to Terry Melcher's own statements to Bugliosi, cited in the Wikipedia summary of trial records, his fear in the aftermath was severe enough that he began seeing a psychiatrist. He took on a bodyguard. Of all the witnesses who testified at the Manson trial, Melcher was described as the most visibly frightened, this despite Bugliosi's repeated assurance that Manson had known Melcher was no longer living at Cielo Drive when the murders occurred. There is a contested layer to even this. In his 2019 book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, journalist Tom O'Neill re-examined the case files and reported finding evidence that Melcher's relationship with the Manson group during 1968 may have been closer and lasted longer than what Melcher disclosed at trial. O'Neill's research, according to the Wikipedia entry summarizing it, included documents suggesting Bugliosi withheld material that complicated the prosecution's theory that the murders were retaliation against Melcher specifically. O'Neill also reported finding records indicating a sexual relationship between Melcher and a 15-year-old member of the Manson group, Ruth Ann Morehouse, whose father had reportedly also stayed at the Cielo Drive house during Melcher's tenancy there. These are claims from one researcher's later reinvestigation, not settled historical consensus, and they have not been universally accepted by other Manson researchers. They sit alongside, rather than replace, the more widely reported account of Melcher as a frightened young man drawn unwillingly into a murder case that would follow him for the rest of his life. What both versions agree on is this: whatever happened in 1968 and 1969, it left a permanent mark. Melcher spent the following decades guarding his privacy, avoiding interviews about the case, and, by multiple accounts, working hard to keep his mother shielded from press attention connected to it. The Manson case was not the only crisis that defined Terry Melcher's adult life. A year before the Cielo Drive murders, in April 1968, his adoptive father, Doris Day's third husband, Martin Melcher, died of a heart ailment. Terry was 26. Martin Melcher had adopted Terry as a child and had, for nearly 2 decades, managed almost every aspect of Doris Day's career. Day had married him in 1951. Together they had built Arwen Productions, the company behind most of her films, along with affiliated music labels and publishing arms. Martin Melcher produced 18 of his wife's movies between 1956 and his death, and by Day's own later account, the marriage had not been without strain. According to her 1975 autobiography, by the mid-1960s Melcher was committing her to film projects without first asking whether she actually wanted to make them, among them Do Not Disturb, The Ballad of Josie, Caprice, and Where Were You When the Lights Went Out. Day has also said that Melcher, offended by the source novel, never even showed her the script for The Graduate, costing her a role that might have reshaped her later career. Some biographers, including David Kaufman, have suggested through interviews with her co-stars that Day privately disliked her husband even as her public statements maintained otherwise. Day herself stated publicly, including after his death, that she believed him innocent of deliberate wrongdoing and that he had simply trusted the wrong person. Day discovered the fuller scope of the financial damage only after his death. Records from the resulting litigation, Day v. Rosenthal, decided in 1985 by the California Court of Appeal, describe how Martin Melcher and his attorney and business manager, Jerome B. Rosenthal, had funneled Day's earnings into a series of failing ventures, oil wells in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kentucky that produced little, cattle ranches, hotels and motels that went under, and other speculative investments, including racehorses. Rosenthal had represented Day since 1949. When he handled her uncontested divorce from George Weidler, and he remained her attorney through nearly 2 decades of escalating entanglement with her husband's business affairs. Estimates of the losses, cited by multiple sources including a legal ethics analysis of the case published after Day's 2019 death, run as high as $20 million. Day also learned, after her husband's death, that he had signed her, without her knowledge, to a CBS sitcom, The Doris Day Show, and had already spent the production advance. According to her autobiography, she was due to begin filming roughly 6 weeks after finding out the commitment existed at all. It was awful, she later said. I was really not very well when Marty passed away, and the thought of going into TV was overpowering. But he'd signed me up for a series. It was Terry, she recalled, who walked her through Beverly Hills and explained to her just how binding and how total the situation actually was. She honored the contract anyway, in part because there was no money left not to. Terry Melcher was not a passive bystander to any of this. He and his mother filed a complaint against Rosenthal with the California State Bar in December 1968, 8 months after his stepfather's death, and 8 months before the Manson murders would consume the following year of his life. Court records list Terry Melcher as a co-plaintiff alongside his mother and his stepfather's estate in the subsequent civil suit against Rosenthal, filed in February 1969, accusing him of fraud, legal malpractice, and breach of fiduciary duty. The case took years. A trial court eventually awarded Day and the estate a judgment exceeding $22.8 million in compensatory and punitive damages, a verdict reached in 1974 though not collected for years afterward. Rosenthal appealed repeatedly, and the litigation dragged on through the Court of Appeal for the better part of a decade. In October 1979, Day settled with Rosenthal's liability insurers for $6 million, paid out over 23 annual installments, a fraction of the original judgment. Rosenthal was disbarred by the California Supreme Court in 1987, nearly 2 decades after the state bar complaint was first filed, for what the court described as a sustained pattern of conflicts of interest and self-dealing at his client's expense. The court's written opinion noted that the case oozes with attorney-client conflicts of interest, and one of the bar prosecutors who pursued the matter for 20 years later described Rosenthal as the man who was too mean to die. Terry Melcher later told the New York Times that the family received only partial payment from the insurance settlement, far short of what the original judgment had called for. By the time the legal process concluded, nearly 20 years of his adult life had passed inside it. This is the part of the story easy to lose in the shadow of CeeLo Drive. In the same 18-month span, April 1968 to August 1969, Terry Melcher lost his stepfather, helped uncover the financial ruin of his mother's career, helped file a state bar complaint that would take 19 years to resolve, and was pulled into the most notorious murder investigation in American history. He was 26 and 27 years old. Years later, Melcher offered his own retrospective verdict on the period, telling people close to the family that his stepfather's premature death had, in an odd way, spared his mother from even greater financial ruin, implying that whatever Martin Melcher's failures had been, the alternative might have been worse still had he lived to keep signing contracts on her behalf. What's notable, looking at the documented record of Melcher's career through the 1970s, is that he kept working. He continued producing for the Bayans, completing Ballad of Easy Rider in November 1969, the same period he was testifying before the grand jury. He went on to produce the band's Entitled and By Maniacs albums in the early 1970s, though the latter drew criticism from band member Gene Parsons, who reportedly called it Melcher's folly over string and horn overdubs added without the band's consent. Melcher also released 2 solo albums of his own, Terry Melcher and Royal Flush. Music critic Robert Christgau, reviewing the former, wrote that he found Melcher's apparent need to address his Manson connections in song both noxious and oddly compelling, a public man working through a private wound in the only medium available to him. He took on the role of executive producer for his mother's CBS series during its first season, helping steer the show his stepfather had committed her to without her consent. In the 1980s, he re-entered the spotlight on more comfortable terms, collaborating with Bruce Johnston and producing the Beach Boys' 1988 single Kokomo, which reached #1 on the Billboard chart, 2 decades after Dennis Wilson had first introduced him to Manson in Wilson's own home. In 1978, Melcher and his mother co-founded the Doris Day Animal Foundation. Several accounts of Day's later life describe this period, the late 1970s onward, as a deliberate retreat from the entertainment industry that had cost her so much, and a redirection of both her and her son's energy toward animal welfare work instead. Whether that retreat was primarily about the Rosenthal litigation, the Manson Association, or simply a natural shift in priorities as both grew older is not something the record settles definitively. Likely it was some combination of all three. By most accounts, mother and son remained close for the rest of his life. Reports describe him as protective of her in a specific, almost procedural way, arranging security details, vetting press access, managing the logistics around her public appearances long after his own career no longer required him to be near a film set or a recording booth at all. Terry Melcher married Therese and the couple had a son, Ryan. Public records of his final years are sparse by design. Those who wrote about him after his death noted his lifelong preference for staying out of interviews, particularly any that touched on 1969. According to the New York Times, Melcher died on November 19, 2004, at his home, following what was reported as a long battle with cancer. Other sources specify the illness as melanoma. He was 62. He was survived by his wife and his son. Ryan Melcher later worked as a real estate agent in Carmel by the Sea, California, the same coastal town where his grandmother, Doris Day, had lived since the 1970s and where she would remain until her own death in 2019 at the age of 97. There is no single, dramatic final document to close this story with, no deathbed interview, no late-life confession, no court filing marking an ending. Terry Melcher spent his last years the way he had spent much of his adult life after 1969, working in the music industry he loved, staying close to his mother, and keeping the press at a careful distance from a chapter he had never asked to be part of. It would be simple to call Terry Melcher a victim of circumstance, a young man unlucky enough to know the wrong drummer, rent the wrong house, and lose a stepfather whose financial decisions ruined his mother's fortune. Some of the record supports that reading entirely. He did not choose to be introduced to Charles Manson. He did not choose his stepfather's business arrangements. He did not choose to have his name invoked, rightly or wrongly, as a motive for 5 murders he had no part in. But the fuller record, particularly Tom O'Neill's later reporting, suggests a young man more entangled with that world for longer than he later described under oath. Whether that entanglement reflects ordinary recklessness common to a 26-year-old record producer in 1968 Los Angeles, or something prosecutors and Melcher himself had reason to minimize at trial, is not something the available documentation resolves cleanly. Different researchers who have spent years on the Manson case have reached different conclusions about how much Melcher knew and when. What the record does show clearly is the cost. A man who, by the accounts of people who worked closely with him for decades, never stopped flinching at crowds. A man who hired security details not for his own appearances, but for his mother's because he could not separate public attention from danger. A man who spent nearly 2 decades inside a lawsuit over money that had already been lost before the suit was filed, fighting for a judgment that was only ever partially collected. He was Doris Day's only child. For most of his adult life, the inheritance that defined him was not money or fame, but 2 unrelated catastrophes that happened to land in the same 18 months of his 20s and that he spent the next 35 years quietly working around rather than away from.